Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Good to see you all. Welcome to The World Over Live. We have another packed show for you this evening. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops held their spring assembly this week in Seattle. They discussed revisions to their sex abuse charter and approved a document on physician-assisted suicide, among other things. Former National Review Board member Robert Bennett and chairman of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability, Stephen Mikochik, both will join us to discuss highlights of the meeting. And later, we'll introduce you to the new chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives, Father Patrick Conroy. If you'd like to be part of the show, the number 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. and internationally 205-271-2980, or drop us an email, worldover@ewtn.com. Here's the brief news from the world over this week. As world leaders continue to condemn the Syrian government's crackdown on protesters, a Syrian Catholic bishop has spoken out strongly in favor of the Assad regime. Chaldean Bishop Antoine Audo says the government must act decisively to curb a rebellion that could lead to the destabilization and Islamicization of the country. Bishop Audo told Aid to the Church in Need that the rebels challenging the Assad regime are not seeking democratic rule. He says a successful uprising could result in chaos and endanger the Catholic minority and Christian minority. He said, "We do not want to become like Iraq. We don't want insecurity and Islamicization, nor the threat of Islamists coming to power." Bishop Otto claims that 80% of the people are behind the government, as are all the Christians. And it's been a tough week for marriage in New York. On Tuesday, Governor Andrew Cuomo proposed gay marriage legislation, and the state Senate appears on the verge of passing the measure. The latest tally has gay marriage proponents just one vote short of passage. The measure could come to a vote as early as Friday. Meanwhile, Archbishop Timothy Dolan of New York has voiced his opposition to the bill, describing it as, quote, a rush to tamper with a definition as old as human reason. He further compared the bill to what goes on in China and North Korea, where government presumes daily to redefine rights, relationships, values, and natural law, end quote. And the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has announced a renewed campaign to strengthen marriage at their spring meeting in Seattle. Bishop Salvatore Cortilione of Oakland, head of the Subcommittee for the Protection and Defense of Marriage, spoke about the initiative and efforts to reach out to the young.
Social teaching offers the strongest and most consistent testimony in the world to upholding basic human rights, equal dignity, and avoiding all unjust discrimination. What we're against is hijacking these principles, so well articulated and developed in our Catholic social teaching, for the purposes of redefining marriage. It has been duly observed that organizations advocating the legal redefinition of marriage label themselves as being for human rights and against hate. Strategies of language are crucial here, and what we see happening in the marriage debate with terms such as equality is similar to the manipulation of language found in the pro-abortion rhetoric of choice. Many of our young people have now come to see what pro-choice really means and embrace instead a culture of life. A similar task lies before us in our efforts to protect marriage.
The bishops also received a report from Cardinal Donald Wuerl of Washington about the new floating diocese, or what's called an ordinariate, to be established for disaffected Anglicans. This is part of an offer Pope Benedict XVI made to Anglicans seeking to come into full communion with the Catholic faith. Cardinal Wuerl said that as many as 100 Anglican priests and 2,000 lay people could be the first to join this ordinariate. The floating diocese would allow them to retain many of their liturgical and devotional traditions while entering into full communion with Rome. Cardinal Wuerl said the ordinariate could be established before year's end. We'll have more on the bishop's revision of their charter to combat sex abuse and the document on physician-assisted suicide in our next segment. And another state has defunded Planned Parenthood. On Wednesday, the North Carolina Senate overrode a veto by Democratic Governor Beverly Perdue, thereby pulling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the nation's largest abortion provider. The State House passed a similar measure on Tuesday. Planned Parenthood has promised to sue. Approximately 1/3 of Planned Parenthood's billion-dollar annual budget comes from taxpayers. And rumor has it that Pope Benedict might soon visit Ireland. Might. According to reports, their high-ranking Vatican officials were in Dublin last week. Their presence was taken as an indication that plans for a visit by Pope Benedict are in the works, possibly in 2012. For several months, Irish church officials have suggested that the Pope might travel to Dublin for the 50th International Eucharistic Congress, scheduled for June of next year. There's additional speculation that the papal visit could include a trip to Northern Ireland, making Benedict the first Roman pontiff ever to travel there. The last papal visit to Ireland was by Blessed John Paul II in 1979. And on Pentecost Sunday, Australia and a handful of other English-speaking nations began use of the new English translation of the Roman Missal. And so far, it's drawn a positive response. Cardinal George Pell of Sydney coyly noted that people are quietly appreciative. Father Tim Norris of Brisbane was a bit more bullish on the new Missal, saying that its use will have, quote, transformative effect and invoke a strong sense of the sacred. He added that the language is so different from everyday speech that it will turn people's minds and hearts to the mysteries of the faith. The new translation is the biggest change in the Mass since the old Latin Rite was replaced 40 years ago. The new Missal will go into full use in the U.S. and elsewhere at the start of Advent in November. And the summer driving season is upon us. If you are venturing out for a family road trip, why not take a great story along with you? The Truth and Life audio Bible is fully dramatized by a cast of world-renowned actors: Michael York, Blair Underwood, John Rhys Davies, and many more. The Truth and Life dramatized audio Bible, it's the only Catholic dramatized Bible available anywhere. It carries the imprimatur of Archbishop Timothy Dolan of New York, and hey, I produced it, so you can order a copy at RaymondArroyo.com. Click on the banner up top. You can find it there or at retailers anywhere. Up next, Washington Attorney Robert Bennett will react to the changes the bishops made to their charter for the protection of children and young people at their spring meeting. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. My first guest is a partner at the international law firm of Hogan Lovells here in Washington, D.C. He was a member of the U.S. Bishop's first National Review Board from 2002 to 2004. You'll recall that board was established to collaborate with the bishops to prevent the sexual abuse of minors in the U.S. and within the church. He's also author of a terrific memoir, In the Ring, The Trials of a Washington Lawyer. Here to give us his take on this week's USCCB spring meeting in Seattle and the bishop's revision to the sex abuse charter is Robert Bennett. Bob, thanks for being here. Pleasure to see you.
Pleasure.
Thanks for coming out. I want to go through some of these revisions. They were to meld and, if you will, make the charter reflect recent letters from the Vatican.
Correct.
Among the changes, child porn is now in this charter regarded as a crime against church law, the possession of child porn. Right. Abusing someone with mental disabilities is considered child abuse. And there are procedures they put forward that deal with bishops who are abusing young people and a process regarding them. Your thoughts on these three revisions, were they worthwhile?
Well, I think they were worthwhile. I don't think they were significant changes, but they're important to have, so there's no question that a child abuse exists if someone is the term they use is habitually lacks reason. And also the child pornography is, those are
an
good,
important distinction.
Those are good things to have.
Okay. And I want to move on to the zero tolerance, because we're going to go to Bishop Hurley in a moment here, the retired Archbishop of Anchorage, Alaska. He's very concerned about the zero tolerance policy because he says, and you'll hear from him in a moment, I don't want to presage his comments, but let me ask you this, your thoughts on how the zero tolerance policy is working out so far?
Well, it's very difficult to know. I think the bishops have applied to the priests a standard which they have not applied to themselves. And I think that to some extent there has been an overreaction, and I think sometimes there are priests who get caught into this and on a mere allegation can have their lives destroyed. And I think there has to be a dealing with that. You have to use a surgeon's scalpel and not a butcher's meat axe. And but this is a bit of an overreaction to what there was nothing before, really, or very little before. So I think that's just a process of working things out.
I want to play this bite for you. This is Archbishop Hurley. Listen to this bite.
There's a great shock among our people against the priests. There's anger against the bishops. And there's anger not just by the priests, but by the people themselves at the way we have failed to handle this whole situation. Now, we can say all we want about it. All I'm saying is that anger is there. And I think we have to start confronting it. Furthermore, if reconciliation is, as I am convinced, our mission, as Christ came down to reconcile everybody, that is the mission that he gave to us. We are not fulfilling it with our present treatment of our priests and the whole matter of abuse. They're out with one stroke, and they're permanently out.
We all care about our priests, and we feel very badly that some of them have put themselves in the difficult position. We also take into consideration that there is no zero tolerance policy with regard to the sacrament of reconciliation. But the sacrament of reconciliation, as we note in our comments, does not lift the penalties against crimes.
The Archbishop was very concerned because he said there are so many priests who are either falsely accused or find themselves in a position where if they are guilty, there's no means to even remain active in any way. There's no forgiveness. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there is some legitimacy to that. But unfortunately, the way things have worked is the bishops have lost credibility on this issue. I mean, you have people like Bishop Fabian Bruskowitz of Nebraska who refuses to participate in what the charter dictates. He won't allow any audits. He won't. He will not do background checks on employees. I mean, it's arrogant, with all due respect, and outrageous.
But Bob, when you look at, and it's interesting you brought Fabian Bruskowitz up, the Bishop of Lincoln, Nebraska. He submitted 28 amendments to the charter, all of which were refused by the committee. Okay. His problem, and he said it in his introduction here, it's fundamentally dishonest, he said, to tell the faithful and the general public the USCCB has any authority whatsoever to bind dioceses to obey the charter. The more commitments, the more grounds for lawsuits, he wrote. Your thoughts as a litigator on that? That seems to make some sense to me.
I think it's nonsense, the idea of bringing lawsuits. I remember when we were created by the bishops. We weren't some outside alien force. Bishop Bruskowitz threatened to sue all of these members of the National Review Board, all of whom were spending thousands of hours for nothing to help the church. So I think his position is terribly wrong on litigation. But he has a point that, you know, there's no one more unaccountable than a bishop in a diocese. And I think the only protection there is the Vatican itself. And thus far, the Vatican has not stepped in and said, Bishop you've got to go along with your fellow bishops. That is, as one expert said, the elephant in the room, the lack of fraternal correction by the bishops to other bishops.
Now, this is Cardinal Shoka, the retired bishop of Denver, Archbishop, of Detroit. And he raises some objection to the new language in this document that says, and I'll read you the language so you're ready when you hear this bite. It says, therefore, if a bishop is accused of the sexual abuse of a minor, the accused bishop is obliged to inform the apostolic nuncio, not the authorities, the apostolic nuncio. Listen to Cardinal Shoka's complaint here.
Throughout this document, there's references to credible allegations. There's no reference to credible in these lines. The second point is the word obliged troubles me a little bit. By what authority, canonical authority, is he obliged?
The charter does not have a canonical obligation. There is a moral obligation that we have made a commitment to ourselves. That is the rubric under which we understand the charter.
As I understand that, it's a moral obligation, but to say he's obliged, I think is a little misleading and too strong.
So it really is, what it really amounts to, Bob, is the honor system. The bishops are, just because of Scout's honor, they have to sort of follow the charter, but there's nothing binding them to it.
That's correct. And I think you really would have to have the Vatican playing a very active role, because I doubt if bishops would say the same things to the Holy Father that they might say to fellow bishops.
And there's something here, you know, there was a recent book, Bill Donahue in his Catalyst magazine from the Catholic League, they covered a book written by a Monsignor William McCarthy. This is a retired priest from the Diocese of Paterson, New Jersey. This priest is accused in 2003, after the charter was adopted, a complaint of supposedly, and he was accused of molesting 2 girls. As it turns out, these were absolutely false claims, but his bishop moved to have him laicized. He was almost laicized, but for Cardinal Ratzinger, who said, no, have a canonical trial. They have a trial, he's totally exonerated. This was false. But he writes movingly about his situation, and that he felt not only did he have nowhere to go, but his own bishop and his own diocese had turned on him. Is this a concern, and should it be a concern for priests looking at this charter? Should it be revised again to give the priests more rights when they're unjustly accused?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I think that there are many priests who probably have suffered a great deal when they should not have been charged at all. But, you know, it's the old axiom that you never get in trouble by acting forcefully. And, you know, many bishops take the view that, well, I don't want anybody saying I did nothing. I can get in trouble for doing nothing, but I can't get in trouble for doing something, even if what I do turns out to be wrong. Of course, you destroy the life of perhaps some dedicated priest.
Yeah. And do you think I mean, you mentioned earlier that you thought this might be an overreaction at this point. Do you think the bishops are so worried about a media backlash that they have to sort of maintain this exterior of toughness and unyielding, zero tolerance in all cases?
Yes, yes, I think so.
Is that a problem?
I think it is a problem in individual cases. I think they have to work on giving an individual priest, you know, it's an allegation that is very easily made, and you can't impose the consequences as if someone has been found guilty. I mean, it's pretty basic to our legal system about the presumption of innocence.
Right.
You don't take a man's livelihood away from him until he is found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
What's unfortunately happening is, to protect themselves from criticism, some bishops, in some instances, are overreacting and are on the mere allegation imposing hardships on an individual priest as if that priest was guilty in fact.
I want to get your opinion on something. I spoke to a retired judge earlier this week, and he said looking in the macro at the way these cases have been rolling out in dioceses across the country, and you have accusations, many of them decades old, but they're coming forward and they're working their way through the legal system. He's concerned that having all the bishops agree upon this charter in some way might be used down the road or very soon as a way to conjoin and connect all of the dioceses and therefore create a RICO situation where a lawyer can come in and say, you know, Bishop so-and-so should have acted in this way. He defied this charter, and the bishops should have leaned on this bishop to act in a certain way. Because he didn't, I'm suing the whole conference. Do you see that as a possibility?
I don't see.
No?
Anything's possible, but I don't see it as a realistic possibility.
Okay, you think it's a bit of a stretch?
It's a big stretch.
Okay.
It's a big stretch.
Let's talk about also the National Review Board at this point. As you look at the work of the Review Board, it seems now I mean, when you were involved, you all were doing diocese by diocese investigations, really. You went in with your staff and you were going to records, you were interviewing bishops, you were talking to priests, victims. That work is largely done. Do we need a National Review Board at this point?
I think we should have a National Review Board. You know, it helps with the accountability of the bishops. You know, the bishops are so close to each other, so tight with each other, that it's always good to have some review board out there that's looking over their shoulder. Now, they don't like that.
Well, they're not even answerable to them. I mean, the problem is, even in dioceses, they have them. I know at least 2 people on 2 separate National Review Boards, or review boards in different dioceses. Cases have been brought to the bishop. The bishop never told the review board about it. They simply don't know about it.
But of course, the review board has the power of issuing a report. When I was on the review board, 3 of us went over and saw well, now Pope Benedict, but then Cardinal Ratzinger just a year before he became the Holy Father. So the review board had some influence by virtue of the authority given it to do certain things. We didn't have authority over a particular bishop.
This John Jay report recently came out. The Criminal College has been doing this extensive report since you were there in 2004. Yes. The findings, to my eye, were not terribly different. In fact, they were identical to the findings of the National Review Board. What was that, 8 years ago? Almost 8 years ago.
Almost 8 years ago.
I want to play a little bite. This is a bite that was of 2 individuals. This is Monsignor James Vallon and Sister Mary Alice Pill. And they are commenting on the findings of the John Jay report, and I want your reaction. Roll that bite.
The other issue was it homosexuality that was the root cause? And the issue from the researcher standpoint is no, that was not the root cause, that it was opportunity. And when they look at the fact that as changes have occurred in society, it's reflected pretty much in what we see. The other was, what are the kinds of societal issues? How does it differ in the church? And we were hoping, maybe there is that silver bullet, if you would.
Sure.
And their conclusions were that there is no silver bullet, that basically anybody in society and anybody in the church can, in fact, become a perpetrator.
And so what I noticed in the report is the importance of the support that one gives in formation.
Absolutely.
And then in an ongoing way to our priests, because they need it seems that it's the person who is the Lone Ranger, who finds himself in the situation where this is a possibility.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's exactly one of the findings.
Bob, your reaction to that analysis of the John Jay report, is that your understanding that this is Lone Ranger and that, quote, anybody in the church can be a perpetrator?
No, I don't accept that. I think, first of all, you have to make a distinction between a pedophile, and that is someone who takes interest in children, 4,
Less
5,
than
6,
5%.
7. I don't know how graphic we have to be,
Yeah,
but hair on the body turns them off.
Right.
They like the smooth skin, literally the smooth skin of a child. That person is typically not homosexual. It's just a very dysfunctional human being.
Right.
But a large number of...
81% of the victims, according to the John Jay report, were post-pubescent males.
That's right, and that's my point. There, the issue of homosexuality is there. It doesn't mean if you're a homosexual-oriented person, you're going to do it. Many of the finest priests I know have homosexual orientation and would never dare do it. But you cannot deny that someone with a homosexual orientation, if they did not have the formation that the sister talks about, could very easily be tempted when they're teaching at boys' schools and going on camping trips with boys. There is no silver bullet, but what has happened now, and I think the church should be complimented. I mean, I'm a critic, as you can tell, on a number of things, but children are much safer today than they have ever been, and they're probably safer in church schools than they are
anywhere else.
Anywhere else. Why? Because more time is being spent on formation. We found when we did our interviews, and I was out literally on the street doing interviews, there was a dysfunctional group of men very often taken into the priesthood. There were those who said, if a man has a calling by God to become a priest, who are we to ask him about his past? Well, that's just narrow thinking. So a lot of very dysfunctional people got in the church. Now it's not that way. One of my young associates, who is one of the best lawyers I've ever had the pleasure of working with, decided to go into the priesthood. Really? And he went through days of psychological screening and testing. So I think that's a second thing. Many of the priests told me that you have a young man, 24, 25. God made him a certain way. He has hormones. You know, they told me they were lost. Nobody would even talk about it. They wouldn't raise it with their spiritual advisors because they were afraid it would be and that just led to more problems. Now it's a lot different. There is much more formation. There's much more awareness on the part of how these young men have to be formed in order to be good priests.
And I agree with you. There's no silver bullet here, but the data does reveal certain patterns that do bear looking into. And
Now, I do feel, in the spirit of full disclosure, I should tell you I have all daughters. So that
Bob's book, In the Ring, The Trials of a Washington Lawyer, is available at bookstores everywhere. Up next, we'll continue our recap of the spring meeting of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. We'll discuss their statement on physician-assisted suicide. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
My next guest is a professor of law at Temple University in Philadelphia, as well as a visiting professor at Ave Maria University of Law in Florida. He also serves as the chair of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability and is himself blind. He worked closely with the bishops to shape their statement on physician-assisted suicide. It's called To Live Each Day with Dignity, which they approved during their meeting. Here to discuss the document is Stephen Mikochik. Stephen, thanks so much for being here. Great to see you. Now, let's talk for a moment about this document. Sure. Why did it take so long? This physician-assisted suicide debate has been raging and been legal in some states since 1994. Why now?
Well, it was legal only in one state since 1994, and that continued on for about 17 years or so.
Right.
We have the Supreme Court in 1997 saying that there's no substantive due process right under the federal Constitution for a physician-assisted suicide. So I think people were lulled into a false sense of security. The Hemlock Society, now known as Compassion and Choices, in the interim developed a fairly large war chest and a very, very effective strategy. And what they thought of doing was to get an assisted suicide legislation adopted in, it was actually a referendum, adopted in the state of Washington.
In 2008.
Right. And this was symbolic because the case that went to the Supreme Court in 1997 dealt with the ban on assisted suicide that Washington State had adopted years before. So they thought that if they could effectively overturn that ban, that this would give strong impetus to the movement. And I think they were right.
I want to play a little bite for you. Sure. This is Cardinal Dinardo. He's the chairman of the Pro-Life Committee and responsible for shepherding this document through the Bishops' Conference process. Give a listen to Cardinal Dinardo.
Sure, of course. From the point of view of compassion, compassion is most stated when we come to the help of a person, giving them assistance to live within their illness, and to help them along if they're in a terminal illness by giving them help, not by ending their lives. So the other point of choice is our choice is the choice to help a person in need. That is to continually bring to them the assistance of the community, the church, and of course help to their families so that they can, most people can deal with illness where there is some sense of support. One of the reasons we keep emphasizing the solidarity part of this is that where people bring solidarity and help to another, then the choice is for life. The choice is for life.
The Cardinal was reacting to a question from journalists about what about compassion and choice? You have to give people compassion and choice, particularly those who are terminally ill. What's wrong with that line of thinking?
Well, first of all, the legislation that was passed in Oregon, the legislation that was passed in Washington, the legislation that was happily defeated in New Hampshire last year, really doesn't give choice. If we mean by choice that somebody is voluntarily acting, there are little, if no, protections for the individual patient in any of these legislative initiatives. For example, there's no requirement that there be a neutral, objective witness at the time the individual ingests the legal medication. So you can have relatives in that situation coercing either formally or subtly the individual who may have, at that point, second thoughts. It's really interesting, Raymond, that over the last 10 years or so in Oregon, compassion and choices has been present at virtually all of the instances where people have ingested this medication. In 1 year, 59 people died from lethal medication under the Oregon plan. Compassion and choices were present, a representative was present at 57 of those instances. Wow. So how can you really say that that individual, because at the time the individual is ingesting the medication, there's no requirement in Oregon, there's no requirement in Washington that there be an objective witness there. How is that really protecting voluntariness? How is it really protecting choice?
And the disabled are truly, you're very concerned, and I know your organization is, at the challenges and the threats this places before the disabled community. What are we missing here? What's the gravest threat?
All right. Right now, the legislation that's being proposed, the legislation that was proposed in New Hampshire, the legislation that was adopted in Washington and Oregon, is limited to terminally ill patients. That is to say, people who have, based on reasonable medical judgment, less than 6 months to live. The problem is the slippery slope. We saw it, for example, in the Netherlands. Beginning in the early 1990s, the Netherlands permitted assisted suicide and euthanasia. Right. It started with terminal patients, and then it quickly went to people who were chronically ill and disabled. The argument being, look, you know, if we want to be, quote, compassionate to somebody who is going to die soon, what about somebody who has to live a life in pain and disappointment? Why should we withhold this from them, even though they don't have a terminal condition? So it went from terminal condition to physical disability, from physical disability to mental disability, from mental disability to mere melancholy and depression. It went from assisted suicide to euthanasia. The difference, of course, is with assisted suicide, the doctor gives you the pill, you take it. With euthanasia, somebody gives you the pill directly. It went from assisted suicide to voluntary euthanasia, then to non-voluntary euthanasia. The person never requested it. And there are instances of involuntary euthanasia in the Netherlands. Bringing that back to this country, we have compassion and choices through their representatives. For example, during the Washington Initiative, former Governor, what was his name? Brooke Gardner.
Brooke Gardner, yeah.
Right. Gardner was one of their main spokesmen. He indicated in a New York Times piece that his real motive in this wasn't to limit it to terminal patients. He has Parkinson's disease. He wants this expanded to include other disabilities. When Compassion and Choices argued to the Montana Supreme Court that the Supreme Court should overturn Montana's ban on assisted suicide, they and the plaintiffs argued that it should apply to terminal conditions, but their definition of terminal conditions was anyone with an irreversible or incurable condition who, if life support stopped, would die soon. That would include diabetes patients, HIV-positive people.
People on a ventilator.
Right, precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Stephen, if you extrapolate this out a bit for me, we're facing a healthcare crisis in this country. Medicare is being, there's rationing going on. We're seeing Medicaid dollars disappear. We have a new healthcare law that just came into being here in the United States. And there seems to be a lot of emphasis on the financial costs of those, particularly the disabled and those at the end of life. Is that a concern for you?
Yeah, of course. And it's not just a theoretical concern. There were two patients in Oregon, one named Barbara Wagner, the other named, I think, Richard Stubbs. And they were both cancer patients, and they had advanced cancer. And they were on the Oregon Public Health Plan, and they requested a fairly expensive bit of medication that their doctors recommended. And what they got in response, in writing, from the Oregon Health Plan was, we won't pay for this, but we will pay for lethal medication. Why? It's simply a lot cheaper.
Wow.
And in the process, you make life cheaper. I mean, the big lie, Raymond, isn't that, particularly when we're talking about terminally ill or disabled people, the big lie isn't that we're talking about death with dignity. The big lie is, for Compassion and Choices and their followers, the only time that a disabled person is dignified is when he's dead. And that's why we're opposing this.
Well, I want to go to the phones. This is Richard. Sure. Go ahead, Richard from Rhode Island. What's your question, Richard?
Yes, Raymond, I wish we could address the hospice care issue where euthanasia is taking place under the disguise of compassion, and that food and drink are being withheld until the passing of that patient in a terminal condition.
Right. Stephen, do you want to talk about this? The bishops in their statement are focusing on palliative care.
That's right.
Pain medication being administered when someone is near the end of life, not denying them basic hydration and nutrition.
If you know what you're doing, you can administer palliative care, including, for example, morphine, without compromising the person's respiration. What's happening in many venues, including, I think, hospices, is that people are being over-medicated with morphine with the aim not to alleviate pain so much as to kill the person. This is a violation of the basic presupposition of hospice care, which is not to do harm, but to provide comfort, both physical and spiritual, for the patient. So your caller, I think, identifies a really serious problem.
Here, Stephen, there's a real challenge because a Gallup poll in May found that 45% of Americans say physician-assisted suicide is fine. Yes. Only 48% are now saying it's wrong. That's significantly skewed from a few years back. What do you do to reverse that trend and that popular acceptance of physician-assisted suicide as a compassionate alternative?
Well, first of all, I mean, that Gallup poll, which is only, what, about 2 weeks old?
May, yeah.
Yeah, is fairly encouraging, because if you look at the Harris poll that was entered into last year, and if you look at the question in the Harris poll, it's very skewed. All right, but in the Harris poll, 58% of the people responding said they were in favor of physician-assisted suicide. All right, now 48% are saying that they're against it. Only 20% a year ago said that they were against it. Now it's 48%, so that's terribly encouraging.
Yeah. Very good. We will leave it there. Stephen Mikochik, thank you so much for coming out and seeing us and for all your insights. It was fantastic. We'll have to have you back on.
Raymond, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I want to, before we go, I want to play a little bite from you. Archbishop Dolan of New York, this was his first chance to be the president of the Bishops' Conference. He was elected last November. He sat in the chair this week, and it was actually a joy to watch the conference. Take a look at this little typically humorous outtake.
I would entertain a motion to accept the minutes. I see Archbishop Nienstead. Do we have a second? Bishop Murphy, thank you. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Excellent. Agenda and let the record show I'm 5 minutes ahead of where Cardinal George would have been at this time, all right? Now, all right.
He was a delight. He's jovial and fun and a great face for the Catholic Church. And you can keep up, by the way, with the National Catholic Partnership on Disability, chaired by Stephen Mikochik, by visiting their website, ncpd.org. They do great work. Up next, there's a new face on Capitol Hill. We'll introduce him to you. The new House Chaplain, Father Patrick Conroy, when the World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
On this day, we ask your blessing on the men and women of the People's House, who have been entrusted with the care of this great nation's people, and because of the great blessings you have bestowed on our nation, the opportunity to build a better world beyond our borders as well. Please teach each member to be generous with the gifts you have given and the opportunities with which they have been presented.
Well, that is a new face on Capitol Hill. He's a Jesuit priest of the Oregon province, and in May he became the 60th chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's only the second Roman Catholic and the first Jesuit to hold the post. Here to tell us about his new job and its challenges is Father Patrick Conroy. Father Pat, thanks for being here. Let's start with your job description here. Now, we saw from that clip, one of your jobs, probably the most visible one, is offering a prayer at the start of each day's session. What else will you be doing? Then what do you do?
Well, actually, that's really the only thing that's in my job description.
Oh, okay. Well, I like that job description.
You know, it's pretty good. I mean, I think this is... I mean, I did many years of campus ministry work on university, and I had some things to do. I had programs to run, or I had places to be, or liturgies to offer. But most of what I did as time went on, most of what I did is I was available to students, and the more I got to know students, the more they got to know me, the more the work expanded. And I think that's going to happen here as well. You know, there needs to be a certain level of comfort for people to start coming, and I think that's going to happen.
Now, you were a chaplain at the University of Seattle, at Georgetown University. You were a high school chaplain when you were plucked out of your assignment and drafted into this job. How do you think, particularly being a university chaplain, prepared you for this moment?
Well, certainly at Georgetown, it prepared me a lot because well, but Seattle U did as well. Yeah. But the population of students at Georgetown was international. It was all faiths, all backgrounds, and many cultures. And so my work was really with a large variety of people. And actually, the retreat program that I ran at the time was intended for all freshmen, not just Catholics. And so not only was I working with young people from all religious backgrounds, they were working together. So I think I, am used to being in that kind of an environment where what we have in common, perhaps, is how can we all be better people rather than how can we all be better sectarians, if you will. And that's really what the position of the chaplain of the house is my role is not cultic. In other words, I'm not providing the religious service for the house. My role is more like a chaplain that's available for whatever the need might be. And, you know, it may or may not have anything to do with God or with religion in the moment.
Yeah.
But it could.
And there are a number of Bible studies, prayer groups that are actively ongoing in the mornings, in the afternoons. I imagine you slowly will find your way into all of those, if needed.
I'll join those, but I don't need to run them, and that's just as well. I mean, the Second Vatican Council says, you know, the people of God, the Spirit's there as well, and so I'm kind of there to witness that as well and say amen. And if I'm asked, I'll certainly do something or respond to something. But for the most part, I'm very comfortable supporting people where they are and encourage them to go where they should be,
now,
where they want to go.
Why and how were you chosen for this job?
Well, you'd have to ask somebody else why. The how of it, as I understand. Now, the new Speaker of the House, John Boehner, once it was clear that he'd be the Speaker, the past chaplain, Father Dan Coughlin from Chicago, wanted to retire. Okay, so it was made known to the Speaker that he'd need to find a new chaplain. And I understand, I don't know this, I didn't ask him personally, that because he was a Xavier grad, Cincinnati, Jesuit University, that he was at least interested in having a candidate who was a Jesuit. It'd be too much to say he wanted a Jesuit, but he wanted a candidate. And my provincial heard of this desire and thought that I could possibly do the job and asked me if I'd be willing to be available, and I was. So I was on the list of, I understand, 5 candidates.
And you were interrogated, or the kind word would, I guess, be interviewed by Speaker Boehner and Leader Pelosi together.
But that was the second interview. The first interview, there were 2 staffers from each office.
Okay.
So they basically asked me most of the questions to get most of the information. So when I met with the Speaker and the Minority Leader, they were just like, I think, getting their impression of the person that I think the staffers had recommended to them.
What was that like? Overwhelming?
Nah. No, that wasn't at all. I mean, my feeling about this, I didn't ambition this position.
But there was a little controversy. I mean, Speaker, then, I guess, Leader Pelosi, she put up an opposition to your candidacy at one point because she said $166 million had been paid by your province in settlements, and therefore it would be improper to have you there. Now, she eventually withdrew that. Were you concerned at that point?
I think I was personally a little anxious, but I also knew that it really wasn't about me. It wasn't.
No, it had nothing to do with you. You weren't involved in any of this. And in fact, I read a report where you were a whistleblower in one of these sex abuse cases.
Early on.
What was that about?
Well, there was actually it was in my home parish.
Yeah.
I was returning from the reservation where I worked at the time to do the wedding of the daughter of my cross-country coach when I was in high school. Went to public school. And her brother, who was a Notre Dame football player, had a friend who wanted to talk to me, and this friend said that the parish priest had propositioned him. Now, as a young man, I think he was too embarrassed to say more than that. But what he said to me is he'd been propositioned, and he didn't want to go public, but he wanted to make sure that the priest wasn't propositioning more.
Other people, yeah.
So I wrote the letter to the Archbishop to that effect. It was years later, of course, once he was an adult, this man, it was no longer anonymous because of unfortunate circumstances, but he was no longer anonymous, so the Archdiocese was able to contact him, and then he said, well, no, he had abused me. And so he was called in and dismissed.
Very quickly before we run out of time, and we are going to do an after interview with the chaplain and share that with you. You can find that online at EWTN.com. You studied political science and thought for a time that you would have a political career. What did you have in mind, and is this what you had in mind?
This isn't a political position.
I know that, but boy, is it close to the levers of power.
Well, I think I feel that I've been particularly blessed in my life. for whatever reason, grace of God, my parents, I've always felt that I was pleasing to God. Not in an arrogant sense, but my parents loved me, and so why didn't God? So that anything I ever wanted to do with my life would be fine, and I would want to do something to please God.
Yeah, absolutely.
So early on, my father was an attorney. I think it's natural enough for a young boy to want to be an attorney, so I did that, and but felt called to the priesthood.
To the priesthood, and you followed it.
So as time went on, there's a number of things that I've wanted to do. I wanted to be a rock and roll star. Well, when I was a chaplain and university work, I led sing-alongs, and it was fun, and I wanted to be all kinds of things.
Father, you're a rock and roll star to us. And congratulations in the new post.
God got me back on the hill.
That's right. That's right. He's got you there, and I know you'll do a great job. For more information on the chaplaincy of the United States House of Representatives and Father Pat Conroy, visit chaplain.house.gov. That's all the time we have. Until next week, you can find updates and the occasional commentary by following me on Twitter or on my Facebook page. Just go to RaymondArroyo.com. You can click through from there. In the meantime, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out our after show. It's online on my blog, EWTN.com. See you soon. Bye now. Thank you again.